Around the country. There's no way to run an economy. There's a better way, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if I could begin by giving my young friend just a gentle reminder about history. From 1999 to 2008, there was something called the Fifth Labor Government. That Labor government sold no assets. That Labor government created Kiwi Bank because we'd had a gutsful of $2.5 billion of money from our banking sector going across the Tasman into Australia. That Labor government bought back Air New Zealand because the so-called very efficient private board bankrupted Air New Zealand, and we bailed it out and got it back on its feet. And that Labor government bought back Kiwi Rail because the so-called efficient private sector had asset-stripped New Zealand Rail, run it into the ground and made it impossible for it to fulfil its role as part of the transport sector. That was the Fifth Labor government. And for Mr Macleay, he had a problem with amnesia as well. He forgot it was the national government in the 1990s that sold the assets. You know, the difference between us and them is that we learned the lessons of history and we're getting it right now. I remember Bill English as the Minister of Finance, who sold Contact Energy in 1999. I've been in this place long enough to know the time we passed legislation under the Muldoon administration to build the Clyde Dam. And Bill English and the National Party flogged Contact Energy off. And what was the consequences of that, Mr Chairman? The consequences were over $1.5 billion in dividends that went out of New Zealand and across the Tasman to the Australians once again. The consequences were that Contact charged more for electricity prices, higher prices. But this national government has learnt absolutely nothing, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, the first thing is this national government has no mandate for this legislation. No mandate at all. If they had the courage of their convictions, they'd take this to a citizens-initiated referendum. Why do I say that? I say to the National Party members, these are not your assets to sell. They are not yours to sell. These assets were built by our parents' generation. And our obligation in this House is to pass on our most successful, our most efficient, our most valuable assets for our kids and their kids after that. Because I say to this National Party here, when you flog these assets off, what are you left with? Nothing. Nothing. You know, in 10 years' time, the dividends from those power companies will be the same as the price that you've got from flogging them off. But the difference is from keeping them is we'll still have the assets and they'll still be providing the dividends year after year for our kids and our grandkids. And I say to Maggie Barry, you know, if flogging off your most valuable assets was a great idea, why wouldn't the Norwegians have sold their oil wells? Because they're a bit smarter, and the Finns too, Mr Brownlee. They're a bit smarter than this thick national government that thinks that it's a great idea to hock off our most valuable assets. You know, even the Treasury, God bless them, gave that advice in the budget policy statement. What did they say? They said the cost of keeping these assets are around $266 million a year. But the dividends you get from them are $100 million more than that. I asked the National Party members which one of them, if they were faced in their family or their business with a difficult economic challenge, would decide that the answer to that challenge was to flog off the best assets that they had and the most remunerative. Well, maybe Tohanare would, maybe Toh would, but actually none of them would do that. None of them would do that because it simply does not make sense to sell off the assets that are so valuable to us and keep producing dividends for us. I remember the time when John Key on the other side of the House was asked the question, I asked it, where does the money go from our state-owned enterprises. And he said why it goes to pay for our hospitals and our schools. Mr Chairman, our hospitals and our schools. Well, I say this to Mr Key. First of all, it's going to cost him $120 million to flog the assets off. That's the fee we pay to the fat cats in the banks. You know that $120 million? Mr Key, that would actually pay for what you were going to spend the money from the increased class sizes on. We could use that money instead of tipping it down the drain and giving it to the banks. $120 million. But I come back to it. There is no mandate for this legislation. 1,421 submissions heard by the Select Committee were opposed to this legislation. Does anybody from the National Party know what percentage of the submissions that was? 98%. Phil Heatley knows. He's good at maths. He could tell us the weighted average. 98% opposed. And you know there were 9 submissions in favour, 0.6. There hasn't been a public opinion poll in this country that has ever showed less than 2-1 New Zealanders' opposition to the sale of these assets. They're flogging off something that's not theirs without the mandate to do so, and then they have the effrontery to say that this is going to go to the mums and the dads. You know what I like about our power stations? Is that 100% of them are owned by the mums and the dads and everybody else in this country. 100%. And you know who they want to flog it off to? They want to flog it off to a few wealthy mates, some big corporates and overseas interests. You know, John Key said this during a debate that we had during the election. Quote, "We're giving people a commitment that 85% to 90% of the entire company," he means all the power companies, "will be owned by New Zealanders. That is my commitment to them tonight as Prime Minister." I say to John Key, where in this bill tonight is anything at all to back up that commitment? New Zealanders will be front of the queue, they said. Where is there anything in this bill to say that that will be the case? Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, the losers in this legislation are all New Zealanders. The winners are a few wealthy people and the foreign investors who will jump at buying these shares up. This is typical of a national government that governs for the few and not the many. And I'm proud in this House tonight to be standing here with the Labour opposition, standing up for the many New Zealanders who are opposed to the outrage of what this bill intends to do. It'll make our internal deficit worse. It'll make our balance of payments deficit worse as the money flows out of this country. It'll push up the price of power, and New Zealanders will be thinking about this right now. The average cost of power, because of the sell-off of these assets, for a New Zealand family will go up between $200 and $300 a year. Maybe not much to John Key or Stephen Joyce or the people that sit over there, but a hell of a lot to the people that I represent in this House that tonight will be sitting there with their overcoats on because they're looking at the cost of the power that they're paying for. And it was our parents that built those assets, our parents that returned got those dividends that can be returned to New Zealanders and that can ensure that in a market that is not competitive, there will at least be reasonable prices for power. And Tauhenare can say what he liked. He used to be part of New Zealand First, and now everything he says in this House is the exact opposite of what he said once in this House. So, Mr Henare, you be quiet and I will give you the charity of my silence, Mr Speaker. Mr Chairman, there is another question, and that's about accountability. This bill takes away the accountability of the power companies to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman said there is no argument for doing that, no argument at all. It takes away the accountability of the Official Information Act. Now, if it's commercial and secret, it's covered anyway under the Official Information Act. But this removes accountability from New Zealanders. It removes social accountability and environmental.
Order. I'm calling David Bennett.
That last member, Phil Goff, said